Welcome. Thank you for coming this morning to our LABC Telecom Roundtable. I'm Mary Leslie. I'm president of the LABC, and I'm getting closer to Councilman here because the mic can only reach this far.
Right.
Okay, so.
We're close anyway.
Yeah,
so
we're
it
so
works
close,
out
and we're
well.
getting so much closer. Okay. This morning, we're honored to have Michael Picker, the Commission President for the California Public Utilities Commissioner, and his colleague, Commissioner Leanne Randolph. And we're looking forward to hearing what our state regulators, our benevolent state regulators, are doing and their plans for the future, particularly in this area of telecom. But leading our effort here in Los Angeles is really Councilman Bob Blumenfield. As you know, he's the vice chair of the LA City Council Information Technology and General Services Committee, as well as the chair of the Public Works Committee and the Gang Reduction Committee. So you're busy.
Yes.
Very busy. So he's going to talk a little bit about what his goals and objectives are as well and help MC this morning's roundtable. But those of you that we invited to be with us this morning as part of this roundtable, thank you for coming. And you're really here because not only are you LABC members, which is terrific, but you are experts in your field. And these are fields of not traditional IT, but really real estate, healthcare, education, and housing. So thank you for being with us today. And as you know, this is an exciting time because we have new technologies that are bringing together our physical and digital worlds. It's really changing the way we live, work, and play. I mean, smartphones, autonomous vehicles, smart energy grids, high-tech information kiosks. These are the things we have gotten used to that are part of our life each day. These are also things that require uninterrupted access to data that is updated in real time. So we are very conscious that there is an expanded digital platform that we need to be aware of, that connects us all, that makes our work more efficient, and helps us reduce our energy dependency. But outfitting this massive landscape with sufficient digital technology and infrastructure is not that easy of a task. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today. What are the policies and programs and the challenges that we have before us? Okay, with that, Council.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mary, for the introduction, but also just thank you and LABC for gathering us all here today. One of the things I love about LABC is that you put together these kinds of things that are really substantive to get people focused and thinking on critical issues. And this is no exception. I'm humbled by the people who are in this room are some really great thinkers and people who have done amazing things in this area. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. And just wanted to make sure I took a moment to appreciate you and the fact that you do these kinds of things for our community and for basically advancing good public policy. So thank you for that. So my name's Bob Blumenfield. I'm a city council member. I represent the West San Fernando Valley, which is, and I know many of you in this room, although some of you I don't know. So it's a pleasure to see old friends and current friends and new folks as well. I represent west of here in Tarzana, Woodland Hills, Reseda, Winnetka, Canoga Park. But I think probably more why I'm here today is I have a very strong interest in not just connectivity, but the intersection of technology and public policy. And it's something that I've been working on really my whole career, but particularly I used to serve in the state legislature. And I ended up kind of by accident developing that niche. It actually started my first week going up to Sacramento, and I'm reading on my Kindle at the time. This was before moving to my iPad. Not that the new Kindle is not great. But reading a story about kids and their backpacks and all the problems they were having, and I started thinking, well, why don't they have digital textbook? I'm holding mine with 2 fingers. And long story, I did a bill to make that happen. We had it was a big fight. We won. All great. But that sort of set me on a path of how do you leverage technology in government and governance to make things better. And that for me has been a consistent theme and something I'm very interested and focused on in a variety of ways. And today we're talking about telecom and internet. And for me, one of my stated goals when people say to me, what do you want to change in the city of Los Angeles? And I have a number of things that you might imagine. I have some that you wouldn't imagine, like one of my goals for the West Valley and for the city is to literally lower the temperature. And we are doing that with something called Cool Streets. You put something on the pavement and more transpiration with the trees and a number of other things. Very exciting, different kind of technology. But another one of my goals, and this is the one I think that we all share, at least in concept, is connectivity. And I'm always out there saying, I want Los Angeles to be the most connected city in the nation, if not the world. And I really believe that, and I've spent a lot of time and energy trying to make that happen. And some of you in this room, particularly Ted and Jean, have worked with me on this, on these efforts. And we're doing it in Los Angeles in many great ways. I mean, our libraries are hooked up. We have more parks. We just lit up the park right, coincidentally, the one right near my house in the West Valley. It was already on the schedule. But we have a number of parks, nothing to do with the fact that I was there, that are lit up, and we have an interesting corporate sponsorship model for those. But what I think is interesting to kind of throw out as an opening comments for this group as to help shape our discussion is that while I think everyone in this room would have the same stated goal as we want to see more connectivity, we don't all necessarily share the same definition of what that means and how that plays out. And I, as a public policy person and as a public official, when I view that, it's the public interest. Part of it is bridging. When I say connectivity, I want to bridge that digital divide. And we can talk about what that means, and everyone here in the room is very sophisticated. I don't need to go into some of the details on that, but I mean, or the hard luck stories where you have the kid sitting outside of the library at 2 in the morning trying to do his homework because he doesn't have access to the internet. But it also means higher speeds. Now, from the corporate side, when you say, I want more connectivity, it has a slightly different perspective, which is we share the same goal. We want to have higher speeds, but obviously you've got a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders, and with more connectivity and faster, comes higher profits. And so generally speaking, the two connectivity definitions are aligned, but they're not always aligned. And I think that's part of the tension that we have in making public policy. And a good example of that is something very timely. It's literally sitting on the governor's desk right now, is SB 649. My former colleague from the Assembly, who's now Senator, Ben Hueso, he has a bill, which probably many of you in this room support, that I'm opposed to. And even though I have that goal of connectivity, and we'll see what the governor does. I hear different things every day about whether he's for it or against it. And knowing this governor, it may just depend on what he had for lunch that day. So love this governor, don't get me wrong. But nobody really knows how he's going to react until he does it. So, but what's the tension here? The bill itself basically makes it easier, takes away some of the discretion of local government to cite the small cells. And from a local government perspective, there's the knee-jerk reaction. We don't like when people take away our local control. And I understand part of the motivation was the feeling that cities were basically unnecessarily, almost extorting companies. In San Jose, there's questions of $14,000 for a small cell. And so there's something needed to be done to make sure that this great new technology can happen quicker. But from the city perspective, it feels like we're losing our leverage to make good things, to make public things happen in the city, and to increase connectivity the way we define it. And that kind of leverage can take the form. There's the financial aspect. On this particular bill, and I know we don't want to spend our time on this bill, but you're lowering the price to $250. LA has been moving these fairly quickly compared to many other cities, but we've been charging about $1,000 for cost recovery. So if the cost that we have to pay is lower than what we're going to be forced to, that means we're subsidizing these cells with all of our other city assets. But it also means we lose leverage from other perspectives, aesthetic perspectives, so they may just be ugly. Or maybe we wanted to do something as a city and have all these small cells look like the Olympic angel, because that's part of what our model for the city, and we thought we could have a cross purpose. We can't really do that if we're being pushed out of that. But we also can't do things dealing directly with the nexus of connectivity, which is the irony of it. Because when we lose the ability to have a say on what's on our poles, and the logical extension of that at some point is also what's on our buildings. You know, why is a pole different than a building? Next year, there'll be a bill that follows this up that says we have to put cells on all of our public buildings and fire stations and this and that. You know, it's all a continuum. But we also lose the leverage of being able to require more access in terms of digital divide. And I know on the state level, the CPUC has requirements, and that's a lot of what's happened. But if we wanted to do more of the tailoring of that, we lose some of that. So I throw that out there not to discuss that bill, but I'm happy to discuss that bill in the discussion, but more to highlight this tension, because I think it's interesting for all of us who have this shared goal, and 90% of the time we're all marching in the same direction, but to look at how that goal can be different, and how it has real impacts. The USC has a project called the Connected Cities Inclusive Growth Map. There's a great article recently, I'm sure a lot of you saw it, where an interactive map of where the connectivity is. And you have parts of LA that have 55% of households don't have high-speed internet access. And that's, you know, it may be an accident, but that's something where if there's design and the city has more leverage, we would be able to control that more. So, just so you know, we are moving ahead, and Ted and Jean could talk about this, with really trying to push connectivity, push getting these small cells done. We didn't need the state bill to get that happening because we were moving very quickly. We have to figure out how to respond, but that is still very much, even though I don't like this bill, we're still moving ahead full speed because that is an important goal for the city. Part of what we're going to do here, we're going to ask ourselves how we bridge the digital divide. I'm sure we're going to talk about personal privacy, workers, jobs, and automation, how that all changes and how it's all related, and interesting ideas about how that model needs to change with workers, and I think we can look to the entertainment industry for some interesting models on that. But I'll stop talking, and so here, to help us understand these issues and many others, we have Michael Picker. He's the president of the California Public Utilities Commission. He has been president since 2014. Prior to his appointment, President Picker was the senior advisory for renewable energy in the Office of the Governor. Also joining us, Leanne Randolph, the commissioner of the California Public Utilities Commission. You're both here and have an amazing amount of expertise, and we're looking forward to the discussion. And so I'm going to turn over the mic to you, and then later I know we have particular questions from individuals, and I'll call on the individuals for those questions. So, Michael.
So I'll try to be brief, and since we're being recorded, I'll try to temper my remarks and be discreet.
No, that makes it more interesting to let it out.
So what is it that connects Californians? What is it? Anybody got any ideas?
Yeah.
Sunshine? No?
No.
What is it?
4.2 million utility poles?
Somebody read something.
A
A network of poles that were built by electric monopolies because they were the best way to finance that connection to every structure in the state of California and to get to scale quickly. If we tried to do it through government programs, it probably would have ended up being pay-as-you-go. It would have been bonded and somewhat expensive. But with a guaranteed revenue stream from electric ratepayers, it was really easy for the electric utilities to go out and borrow lots of cheap capital, build those poles, connect everybody, string electric wires on them, and provide Californians with electricity. So what's on a wooden pole nowadays? At the top, you'll see those three wires for the three-phase electric AC current. There's an interesting history as to why we're not all a DC electric system. But below that is usually the old copper wire for telephony. Below that is cable for cable service, frequently aluminum, and just provided content for the cable companies. But below that is fiber. It's usually fiber from one of the telephone providers that provides telephony, voice over internet protocol telephony, content. Think AT&T's Uverse or Verizon's content, and internet service. Below that is the cable company's fiber that's providing telephony, voice over internet protocol, providing content, and providing internet service. These are functions. They're not really technically different. It's just data. But that's what the value is to the customer. And then if there's enough space and the pole is strong enough to carry it, there's sometimes a third provider's cable, fiber to serve business. Each of these poles carries more data and is more intelligent than the entire United States was in terms of infrastructure in the year 1980. Think about it. Each pole, and they're crowded. Each of those pieces of infrastructure in a strong wind, does anybody know any cities that has strong winds?
Yes.
All that infrastructure acts as a sail. If the pole is weak or if it's overloaded, it snaps. I started to discover all this when I went out to look at poles in Malibu after the Malibu fire. There, the poles snapped because an independent telecommunications provider was attaching their equipment to the pole after having been told by the electric company that the pole was weak, couldn't withstand any more infrastructure, and could snap in a high wind. That caused a pole to snap, faults between the electric wires, fires. So I'm just telling you that there's a set of challenges we face here. So first and foremost, this is becoming very hotly contested real estate. There's no bigger fight in the utility industry. You think that the fight between the environmentalists and the electric utilities about renewables is serious? That's dumb. Renewable electrons are a commodity. They're cheap. The electric utilities really don't care who serves it. They haven't owned it for a long time. They contract. They know they are making money on the wires. As a matter of fact, they have their own fiber backhaul for their smart meters. And they oversized it. And they're selling it to telecom providers. And they have been for years. That's where the power is. Access to poles, hotly contested. When Google Fiber wanted to string fiber and do their Google gigabit program in Silicon Valley, that was the thing that defeated them. There was just no room on the poles. Now, it's possible that some of that old telecom infrastructure, the copper wires for telephony and the old cable is actually just ghosting, that people pay their rent to be on those poles to keep competition off. We don't know, and I can answer questions as to why we have a very weak picture of what's going on in poles. But if these poles connect Californians, and they are what people are after, you can understand why there's this hot contest that's taking place in Sacramento and other power centers over who gets access to them. It's our unfortunate task to remind people that these poles were paid for by electric ratepayers. We as ratepayers have an interest. We also have an interest in the fact that they don't become overloaded and become unsafe. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of the rate increase in Southern California Edison's last general rate case was to replace old, frail wooden poles. If you're a regulator and you're in the middle of recessions, as we have been in the past, if you're a utility, and especially if you're a ratepayer advocate, one of the easiest things to avoid allowing expenditures on is replacing dumb wooden poles. I mean, who here loves their wooden pole near their house? Anybody? Does anybody here want to buy their own wooden pole? Does anybody have rooftop solar? Okay. Why would you buy cheap electrons as opposed to actually investing in this incredibly contested, valuable piece of infrastructure? If you own that pole, you can make everybody else in your neighborhood pay for access to their electricity. You can make them put the solar panels on their roof and give you electricity in order to get access to the grid. So I'm telling you, people are barking up the wrong tree here. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a different topic.
So I'm sorry, I was very,
Pause, we like it.
very clear, contrite and discreet. I could go on.
Well, it's the. I guess one of the two themes I wanted to talk about is kind of related to that, which is, we forget that all of this incredible, exciting, high tech is really based on this very old-fashioned piece of infrastructure, right? And the digital divide we talk about, when you guys talk about the digital divide in Los Angeles, you get to talk about being concerned about the speed and access to quality service. But we forget that in California we have two kinds of digital divide, which is you have the economic digital divide, but we also have the geographic digital divide. We have large swaths of California that really don't have much access at all. And as a commission, one of our responsibilities is to administer programs to encourage and provide that broadband access. And so we have the California Advanced Services Fund, which provides, surcharges customers to provide funding to build these projects. But in that program, we have definitions of communities that are served and qualify for a smaller subsidy, or communities that are unserved. And the definition of served is 6 megabytes per second down and 1.5 up, which is like nothing. And, and so it's important to remember that there are communities out there that are just getting the minimal amount of broadband service. And some of these communities are in, very far-flung rural areas. And some of these communities are really not that far from major metropolitan centers, but the geography is such, or the population density is such, that that you have these pockets that just don't get the kind of service that those of us who live in large metropolitan areas are able to access. And President Picker and I have had some disagreements on the dais at the commission, because he always worries about fostering, growth in some of these far-flung rural areas. But the way I see it is that, all of our residents in California need access to these services because they have become so essential to our basic livelihood in the state. And so we need to make sure that some of these little pockets are able to receive service that is expensive to build out, and that does need some sort of assistance in building it out. But it also highlights the challenge as a government agency of trying to keep up with, changes in technology, changes in the regulatory landscape. I mean, our constitutional authority is based on these technologies that existed 100 years ago, and were just coming to fruition in the beginning of the last century, and now they look very different today. And so we recently did an analysis of telephone competition in the state of California, and we spent all of this time talking about what kind of landline access folks have. But the reality is that the landline market is tiny, and most folks don't receive their communications through that old technology. And so, how do we make sure that everybody's got some basic access to communication, but also recognize that sort of the days of kind of the command and control regulatory landscape at the PUC, is over in terms of the communications industry. And we need to be thinking of ways we can protect customers and protect safety in a completely different landscape. I mean, we have another example of a serious fire involved a perfectly permitted cable that broke and caused the electricity connection to detach and sparked a fire.
Snapped in a wind, arced up and over the 3 wires, caused a fault, melted the wires, started a forest fire that took out large parts of San Diego County.
Right. And so, we need to be cognizant of that basic safety interaction between the different utilities and how they appear on the poles and how our staff can make sure that they are in compliance with our general orders related to safety. So that's kind of the landscape that we're looking at as a regulatory agency, which is probably a little different than the excitement of 5G. It's a little more mundane.
I forgot to mention that we have a copy of our first California Public Utilities Commission comic book, the Natural History of Wooden Poles, which talks eloquently and includes an excerpt of a profound poem by John Cheever, talking about the history of the electric pole, of the wooden pole in California, and how it has brought civilization to the state of California. Encourage everybody to grab a copy either here or on our website.
And you'll be signing them for $1.99?
No, I didn't write it, so.
Okay.
But
So
I will be telling you to send your kids not to college, but to line workers school.
yeah, it's amazing what we invest in our line workers. This came up during our recent discussions, and it's more than a college education by far.
LA Trade Tech has one of the better schools in the country, and those people are in demand. Energy analysts.
All right, so the next portion, we have some questions that have been, some questioners with questions that have been predetermined. I'm gonna call on each of them to ask their question, make their comment, give you guys a chance to respond, and then after that, we'll open it up to other questions and discussion. So starting with our very first question, we have the co-founder of Meeting of the Minds, Mr. Gordon Feller. He's someone who knows all things about IoT, and the floor is yours.
Well, I put this question together. I'll read it. Assuming we want to encourage the adoption on a wider scale of transformational and emerging technologies, what new state level and local level policy options should be considered as must-haves by those of us who want to speed the time it takes for successful deployment? And the reason I'm asking is really this. I'm spending almost every day now with some of our partners like Ford Smart Mobility is the company they've created, or Toyota, Volvo, and some of those who are working with them like Deloitte and AT&T, Microsoft. So these are companies who are teaming up with local communities to deploy autonomous vehicles, whether for car share, ride share, taxi services, delivery services. And it's happening worldwide. I was in one of the autonomous taxis in Singapore last week. Quite a nice ride. Not too similar to what you get in Boston with Nutonomy, because the roads in Boston are quite different. So all of these local communities with their partners in the big auto companies are asking how can they speed the adoption of these technologies to enable full, true autonomy if those communities would like to have that. And some communities don't. But the challenge for a lot of those city councils and county commissioners and state-level policymakers is the wide swath of policies that already exist, some of which are disincentives. And I'm not an advocate for clearing the underbrush and uniformly saying, this must happen, therefore let's clear the path. But the question really is, to you at the PUC and to you at the local policymaking and legislating level of California state government, what are the things that you think could be done, should be done, must be done to make faster adoption of emerging technologies that will have material benefits on the quality of life for people, whether it's for traffic congestion purposes or for road safety purposes or any of the other public goods that we want? And I suppose it's a round the table question, but I'm particularly interested in people who are on the front lines of policymaking.
I guess I'll just start by echoing what President Picker said about, I really don't think you can understate the importance of pole access. And the regulatory landscape around pole access is incredibly complicated. Yep. Because you have ones that are owned by utilities, and you have ones that are jointly owned by communications companies and utilities. And the reality is that the incumbent telecommunications companies own and help control access to those poles through the two pole management entities. There's a Northern California entity, there's a Southern California entity. And they're not crazy about competition in terms of new entrants into their space. And they, each pole has its designated space, and there are fierce battles over that real estate, as President Picker said. So I don't think you can understate that point.
So, we haven't really seen true 5G deployment, and that's what really is what you're talking about.
Yeah, sure.
Behind all the rhetoric, you're talking about access to 5G, because it's a broadcast technology. It's a short range. It's about 300 meters, which means that we probably will have to have a number of broadcast points that's probably 20 times greater than the number of cell phone towers we currently have. So if you need access to fiber for backhaul for all that information, because nothing else will carry enough information, if you need access to electricity to power that 300 pounds of equipment at each of those 5G transmitters, if you need to be present where there are people and the users of those technologies, whether that is personal, which seems less important than the Internet of Things and autonomous vehicles to have access to that broadcast information, you got to have something that's above ground. Can't do it with conduits. You have to have something that's above ground. So undergrounding the infrastructure is actually, we're going to retard promotion of these new technologies. San Francisco could be the last place in the United States to actually get 5G because they've undergrounded all their infrastructure. You need to have access to those other services. What does that? You had the answer earlier.
4.2.
Yeah, 4.2 million poles. So why SB 649 that would preempt locals? So, it is the nature of the California Public Utilities Commission that we were designed to build statewide infrastructure and to preempt local control. That was the way you got railroads that went up and down the state. That's how you got telecommunications. That's how you got, there's pictures here of downtown Market Street in San Francisco where you can't see the sky from the competing poles. And nobody was making money because everybody had poles. And they had poles on one side of the street that were servicing businesses on the other side of the street with telephones. And it was not centrally planned. So I can see that this is going to come to us because that's the intent, is to get large, long-lived infrastructure deployed quickly and cheaply. That's exactly why we got Lyft and Uber, is because of that preemption of local control. This is why we are not an agency that does like. We do an agency that does hate, things that people hate. We raise rates, we make them have infrastructure they don't like. I have never yet had people beg me to put a transmission line in their community to provide all those goods. They always want it someplace else, but they want that telecommunications, they want that reliable electricity. So I'll just say that that's one of the things that people will demand to actually make this happen, is one central agency that will actually be the promoter of the infrastructure. Is that good? Is that wise? I have no idea, but that is the shitty job that we get.
We can quote you.
It's on tape.
It's not the first time he said it.
That is not why, that's why she didn't roll her eyes.
And I guess for the local answer, I'm going to play on both of what you said. You know, on the one side, and I appreciate what you're saying in terms of the role of PUC and state, but when you have, especially a big city like Los Angeles, of course, we're very resentful of the loss of local control. And one of the things you have to think about to make these policies successful, it's not just the uniformity, it's local buy-in. You've got to get communities and people to accept. You can't jam policy in a democracy, but generally speaking, current presidential administration aside, you can't jam certain policies through for very long if you don't have that local buy-in. And so part of the answer to your question is having a little bit more of that local buy-in and having that control. But the other, in terms of getting that local buy-in, speaks to what you said, which is you have to also look not just at the policy, but of what are the entrenched interest groups that are out there that are going to be competing with that policy. And I think about when you mentioned autonomous vehicles, I was actually on the State Assembly Transportation Committee the day that and I was late to committee the day that the vote was happening on allowing testing of autonomous vehicles in California, of something I was very bullish on. So, and when I got there, it was dead even. It may not have passed. Once I got there, I pushed it over the top, and I was really bullish on it, and it was.
This was Alex's bill?
This was Alex's bill,
Yeah.
yes. Alex was presenting it, but who was opposed to it? It was the auto companies. They were there testifying about the liabilities, and they had 100 different reasons why it wasn't going to be good, and why we didn't have it worked out enough, and how we couldn't test it here, and all this other stuff. We pushed it through, but it's to your point about you've got to look at where those interests are when you're thinking about what are the local policy changes you're going to make. And that's both on the state level, but also here at the local level. And sometimes that looks, on the city level, looks like NIMBYism, especially when you're talking about polls and, people don't want to have, something in front of their house that doesn't look right. And some of that is reasonable and some of that is not reasonable. And how you set the stage for that will determine what kind of buy-in you get. So I guess the uniform answer to that question is we need policies that will also enable local governments to work with constituents to get the buy-in. Because on the natural, we want all this stuff, right? I mean, who wouldn't want, all this exciting new stuff that technology is generally more, you get more for less, you get safer streets. All of our stated goals are served by all of these technologies if you can make them happen.
Dude, you're the city of LA. What does the city of LA have?
We have a great population. We got the Dodgers.
Some of the 4.2
Dodgers in the playoffs.
GWA is not just intended to steal water from Northern California.
Well, that's a good part of it.
The electric infrastructure to power that water through the community. You have a network of poles.
Absolutely.
What's on it?
We have all.
Where is it?
All over.
Do you have a map?
Yes.
Yes.
You have a map. Okay, great. You now have something of incredible power in this discussion. Why aren't you stealing a march on all these folks? Why aren't you out there soliciting bids for the fiber that you can put on in your electric system that will provide the power and the electricity to do that? Where do you need to have that to complete that? Where do you need to have that to bridge your digital divide? Why are you even talking to me? I'm going to be breathing down your neck to make sure you don't overload it and kill people.
Yeah.
But you have the tool
Absolutely. And then the question is how we leverage that and how we build it, whether we do it
Well,
on our own as a
Where there are
utility.
constraints where you can't put more stuff on it because it's overloaded, how will you make the decision as to who gets to be on it?
Well, we'd like to make that decision and not have that choice taken away from us.
Wait. There's nothing about the federal government that can defeat the physics of too much stuff on your poles. Because if there's too much stuff on your poles, then we're gonna make somebody take something off. Because we don't want people to get killed.
And I think we all agree
All right.
on that.
So you gotta get there first.
Yeah. And so actually, that leads us to our next questioner, who will actually may want to take that up as part of his preamble to his question, and because I got to keep us moving here. And
We're moving.
Ted has been a great general manager for IT. We've been thrilled to work with him. We worked on the CityLink RFP together, digital inclusion issues, the connectivity working group. He's doing a fabulous job doing just what you're talking about in terms of moving us forward. So Ted, you have some comments on your question.
Certainly. I would love to be able to ask a question less around polls and more around people for this one. Certainly, we're in a world in which the internet has changed the way that we live, it's changed the way we communicate, it's changed the way we play, and in many ways, it's certainly changed the way we work. In our digital economy, there's a lot of concern that some communities lack the connectivity and the skills to compete. So certainly some parts of the economy are advancing forward, but there's plenty of communities that are not, or certainly not at the pace that we would like. What can we as Californians do to better prepare all communities for the emerging digital economy?
I don't do people, I do infrastructure. There are all kinds of people who come to us and prattle all day about people, and it's usually a screen for wires, poles, transformers, infrastructure. So I do infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, it does always come back to polls, but, I mean, it does, there are, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, there are sort of government programs that sort of take surcharges and create access with those surcharges, but they're not adequate. I mean, they're not really closing that gap. Without sort of recognizing that it's not just basic access, but it's, true connectivity that needs to be the goal. The existing programs really kind of won't get us there.
So here's the kind of questions that we get.
Sure.
We
I was
get-
going to rephrase it for you, by the
We
way.
get asked to provide a fiber cable to a community of 1,700 homes that's outside of a suburb of San Jose, about 30 miles outside of town. And they really make the argument that they need fiber to their home. And so we spend a lot of money not just getting the fiber to their community, but to their home.
Yeah.
And they insist on undergrounding it. And because they think it will destroy the rural values of their homes. So,
Well, let me ask a
the
question.
challenge is, what is it that Californians really want? We have a lot of programs that paper over this central question. What is it that we really need, and do we have a long-term vision? If we're paying big dollars to let people underground it, but 5G is going to require broadcast technology, did we actually set them back?
So let me ask this question. It's about polls and not people. Not all polls are equal.
Yeah.
Right? And so certainly if you are a vendor and you're delivering service, you're a provider in Los Angeles, some communities are more affluent and will pay more money for more, and some communities are less affluent. How do we incentivize, let's say as governor, if you have any experience, how do we incentivize the connectivity to the poles that aren't as affluent? so we could try to get them better connectivity and try to ensure, and you know, because the reality is, in different eras, there's been different definitions of what separates the haves and the
Well,
have-nots.
first tell me, do you have the core infrastructure, the pole, the conduit? What, do you have that? Do you have a map that shows me that you actually have adequate pole? Do you have space on the pole?
So there's communities that are less affluent that have poles and streetlights. But it requires an investment in that community for them to be able to access that
I'm just questioning whether
connectivity.
you actually have a good picture of that infrastructure, because then the fiber is the next step. But again.
But there's got to be a motive and an incentive. There's got to be, and I think this is where
Dude, you're the city of Los Angeles.
Yes.
You raped Northern California for their water.
Oh, my
You
God.
did it successfully.
Get over it.
You did it.
So
So don't tell me. you
Maybe
don't
we should
have
move to the next
resources.
question.
I want to focus on something, on another part of what you
Build your own
said,
damn fiber.
which is, and this is, I guess, a question
You
back
don't
to
have to
you.
steal our money.
Which is, as the technologies change, like, how do we deal with the question of what investments do we put in a particular technology, and what happens when that technology gets passed by? Because that's really the issue that hits those underserved areas, right? Because you do have this leapfrogging effect where government is like trying to catch up and like, okay, yeah, we'll fund this project for you, and you're going to get this level of connectivity. But in the meantime, the affluent areas are like, yeah, we've gone on to that level over there. And then you're like, oh, crap, now we got to go back. And I don't know how to solve that problem because there is that sort of challenge where government is always just a little bit behind. And so is it really a role for government, or is it more of a role for, to say to the industry, okay, if you're going to do these things, then you're also going to have to pull in other areas in addition to your prime customer base.
So I'm going to talk about one of the things I think that underlies this that will be helpful. But part of the challenge here is that we regulate 3 very large electric utilities. We do not regulate or provide oversight or resources to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So here, where one of the core pieces of infrastructure that actually helps to meet the need that you're talking about is the poles, which you own and control, you're asking us to provide ratepayer dollars or tax dollars from outside. So I'm trying to understand better, what is it that you have in place? What are your intentions? What's your assessment of the need? And until we have that, it's very hard to have a rational discussion. And I worry that without that, this becomes one of those things where people plead for the state to step in. So let me just tell you that the first thing that we need in the state of California is a better picture of where that underlying infrastructure is, poles and conduits. We do not have a single database. We know that there are 2 private databases that the electric utilities used in the distant past to actually apportion payments for access to their poles to the telephone companies. So, but they don't release that data. It's hard to get access to it. So if you're a provider, you don't know what the route is to actually begin to provide this kind of infrastructure. Neither do we. And that's why I'm just challenging you guys is to say, do you have that map? Do you have that picture? Is it something that other people can have access to so that we can actually figure out what's the best route to actually meet the needs of those people? Where should the fiber go? What do we need to do to make sure that the next technologies are going to be accessible? And so until we can actually have that kind of a rational infrastructure about how much of what do we need, it's very hard to answer your question. It is ultimately a people a question, and what lies behind that isn't a cold, sober sense of what it is that we actually need. It's a sense of victimization. And so I don't think that's the way to approach this. Let's start with a picture of what is the infrastructure the state of California needs? Who has it? What are the constraints? What do we have to do to perfect that system? Then how do we begin to finance and make it accessible to the public? That is a rational public policy discussion.
You know, the infrastructure definition of what that infrastructure is seems to change with the technology, though, as well.
No shit.
With 5 cells, sometimes it gets closer. Now, you need more poles closer together. Sometimes it gets further away. Sometimes our definition of what that infrastructure and what that pole is also going to change. We have cells on this building here. It's a public building. At what point are all of our public buildings considered poles? Are all of our fire stations considered conduits? All of our libraries, all of our buildings? How much control do we have over all of those conduits? And how do you distinguish the use of a public building or a publicly owned or a public-private partnership or your individual house that happens to sit on a corner and we want to take your rooftop, or whatever it is? I mean, that's a moving target. Yes, the poles haven't moved for a long time, and that's a good thing, and there's a beautiful book here he's going to sign afterward, even though you're not the author of it. But it is a moving target, so it's not as easy to nail down, but I agree with you in the sense that we can.
So that's a different question, which is how do you make large infrastructure that's long-lived more nimble to meet the needs of new technologies?
Well, I will say, from the point of view of the national grid infrastructure, so I'm on the Secretary of Energy's committee to help the new secretary and his staff think about what to do with grid modernization to make it more resilient. And this is good luck with that. And the DOE is struggling with this problem too, because
they're barking up the wrong tree. As a matter of fact, they're focused on fuel supply at coal plants and nuclear power plants, when actually most of the storm-related outages are due to down poles.
Well,
So
that's
get
the
them
point.
back on
That's the
track.
point we've made to him and his executive staff, and the problem is they say we don't have the data because the utilities own the data and they're not required by federal law to share the data.
So
which
come
is
back to
flip-
that.
Flip side.
How do we create a better database in California so that we can work together to actually define what the right pathways are, so that people don't make tragic mistakes, either as private entities through asserting some kind of exemption, or as local or state agencies picking the wrong pathways? And that to me is the public policy decision that we could lead on here in California.
So if I could just contribute?
Yeah, please, Jean.
So one of the issues is we do actually have that data. So Council Blumenfield's office serves with Ted's office on a connectivity and digital inclusion working group within the city of Los Angeles. And so we have a set of city assets that are important to this kind of digital inclusion. So city buildings, because macro cells and antennas go on city buildings. We have 150,000 streetlights, which are core to small cell deployment. We have power poles. We have the ability to put in monopoles if needed. It's not necessarily our first choice. And we also have other assets like above ground facilities. We have the data for that. Some of that data is shared on our open data portal. So a company can come to Los Angeles and say, these are the specific streetlights that we would like to put our small cells on, and work through the permitting process.
Well, we'll be there soon. We actually have a order to actually create a single state source of information so that everybody has access to that. Curiously, no local government chose to participate in that. So we're waiting to find out what you guys have, how you store it, how it's accessible. Does it have all the information that might reasonably be necessary to figure out where there are constraints in the system to be able to cure those issues of access? But like I'm saying, local governments have chosen not to participate in that. So we still don't have that rational statewide public policy discussion.
I guess we're probably pretty far ahead in LA in that respect. We did
Great.
an RFP
Get up and
to
go.
try to create a public-private partnership, which I think we'll talk about later, and we literally listed out. We got all the groups together in our city and tried to put all of our assets out there. It's a public document. We're happy to share it.
I think that's really a smart thing to do. And to the extent that you can actually tell people how to meet their needs conveniently, you're not going to get into these disputes. If you actually get there before they do, they're going to follow your leadership. So I encourage that. But I will say that LA City is kind of intermingled with the county. And, you have Van Nuys, but you have Burbank in between. And so this is not going to be completely easy until somehow or another we have that statewide discussion. But I encourage you to get ahead of the game, because to the extent that you lead, everybody's going to follow.
Can I ask a question of the city, which is kind of the same question you asked? I mean, sort of, what do you guys see as the the challenges and roadmap or roadblocks to better connectivity in the city?
So I think the issue is, we also use the USC Annenberg School broadband map, looking at some of the areas of inequity. And so we're actually really open to doing public-private partnerships and different kinds of agreements with the telecommunication providers and lots of others who have maybe very different kinds of technologies and ways of trying to provide connectivity. I like to think of LA as an urban proving ground. Like, we are open to things that will help Angelinos connect better, with always an eye towards equity. So if you look at the USC maps, you'll see that South LA is just a really sad, sad case of a lack of good broadband access at home. People, I think you mentioned before, we see students trying to use an old cell phone with perhaps not enough data access to be able to do their school homework and then compete against other kids who have a laptop at home. So we want to encourage the build out of all of the connectivity for all Angelinos, but in a way that also helps to lift up those communities that we consider underserved.
Now, I see you want to add a quick thing, but I see we're running on our
No, I'd allow the
time.
next question.
I couldn't figure out anything that I would do within what you just said. What is it that you need for us to do to help you overcome that? I understand the challenges and barriers. You say there's a map of where there's underserved. What is it that you need to actually meet the needs of those folks?
So I think we run into challenges where some of the telecommunication companies are open to helping with those digital equity issues and inclusion. I think from a state perspective, we're really challenged, as you say, when they start looking at the technical infrastructure and how they want to build across geographies, that we do have this issue of connectivity across the city because of just these pockets of Beverly Hills and other cities that kind of interrupt our geography. And more importantly, the ability to kind of have that ownership conversation. So I think what Councilmember Blumenfield said earlier about being able to say, these are our city assets, we would like to offer you the ability to use those, but in a way that we know that's going to be true today and maybe 2 months from now.
Let me get, because we're running very short of time, and we have a couple of the questions that are preordained here, and I want to make sure I get to the we have 3 of those coming up, get through those, because we end at 10 o'clock. So Wendy is the next questioner, and known Wendy for whatever. Since I used to work
I was a child.
Yeah, back, I think, well, since the 90s when I
Right.
was at the Conservancy. And anyway, she's the co-chair of the LABC Legislative Affairs Committee and really a great leader in the city. So,
Oh,
Wendy.
thank you very much. Not as long as I've known Michael Picker, because out of everyone in this room, I have known Michael Picker the longest. I was still in college when we worked together. So that's why I find his slamming and all of that very humorous, because it just brings me back to old days. And, you know, I had a preordained question that was about 5G deployment and what the PUC could do.
See, she
but-
still doesn't pay attention.
Right, but I'm not going to ask it because I don't want to be blamed for Owens Valley and be called dude by you. So I guess we can kind of...
Dudette.
It sounds to me like, though, the city of Los Angeles is well-positioned, given what you guys, I mean, and I think it seems like you're dealing with the fact that you don't have all the information you need relative to the polls and how you're going to regulate that. You know, being an investor-owned utility, being a municipally owned utility, LA is not regulated by you. So how that kind of intermixes into a statewide policy in which, you know.
Okay, so, but the one actionable thing that I've heard is that you acknowledge that there's a challenge trying to get across the seams between the city and the county and the other cities to actually do some real coherent planning. That strikes a bell with me. I think maybe we can figure something out. That's what we're trying to do with this order that's trying to put together the single poll database with GIS information so that we can start to look at those things, compare it against those maps, figure out where there's inadequate infrastructure, knowing what's on those poles, so we can figure out the quality of the fiber so that we can actually start to monitor that. Similarly with conduits, I've already explained why I think conduits are probably a challenge, but still, you know, it's there, we got to use it. So conduits are much harder to map. You may have good maps of conduit in LA, but I'm skeptical Because everybody tells me they have a good map till they have a problem and they discover the conduit wasn't where they thought it was. So I just think that we're gonna have to do some real basic stuff and then talk about what it is people want and what it is people need. And then we're gonna have to figure out who has the capacity to do things. But again, to the extent that poles are constrained infrastructure, and somebody sooner or later is gonna have to make a decision as to who gets on and who doesn't, or who has to come off if it's already overloaded.
I think that feeds into our next question. It's related, actually, to a question I think Mary's going to ask. Mary, as all of you know, is the president of the LA Business Council, and probably needs no introduction because you know everybody here, but is a wonderful leader who brought us all together.
Thank you. So thank you, Commissioner Eckert, for pointing, and Randolph, for pointing out some of these issues, because I don't think we've thought about them in the way that you're proposing them right now, even after we read the poll report.
She's much more
Which
rational
apparently
than me.
Allison gets an A for, because she actually knows how many polls we have. If we had a gold star, you get it today. But I find this really interesting because we spent a year on a rate increase at DWP. We are going to spend $17 billion in the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years. As far as I can see, half of that's for polls. Like literally, when you look at the $17 billion, it's for polls. It's all about the polls. So maybe we have some other work with our city IT, with Department of Water and Power, because we're about to invest at least $8 or $9 billion in our polls in the city of LA. Okay, so with that was a statement, really not a question. But what I'm feeling right now is I feel like the business people in this room got to be sitting there going, okay, that's nice. I got to see under the kimono today. Okay, I'm watching these guys, talk about what they're doing and what they're not doing. But I'm trying to run a business, and I'm trying to compete in a world economy, and I'm trying to move people forward, and we've got a bunch of consumers who really like all their gadgets and stuff, so don't thwart me. So what is the role of the private sector now? Because how are they supposed to interface in this situation where they need this infrastructure, they need people to be organized, they need you to have a plan? What are they doing right now? What should they be doing?
I mean, I'll start with, because I think it leads into telling you a little bit about the RFP that we did as a city that didn't really work. But even before I say that, when we talk about infrastructure and conduit, we also need to expand our vision there too, because what is our sewer system? I mean, in many ways, it's a giant conduit. And we can, we have that mapped out, and if we're creative, we can start using that kind of infrastructure as well, especially as these fiber takes up much less room. Obviously, you can't clog the pipes for other reasons, but you can use that. No double entendre there, Wendy. No. But something that we did here in LA, I think, speaks to this. We wanted to bring in the private sector to create, to make Los Angeles the most connected city, to put together an RFP where we would have free wireless service throughout the city of Los Angeles. I thought this was a great idea. I championed it for a couple of years. Ted and Jean worked on it. And what it was a basic value proposition where we said, we have these assets. We have poles. That was what I thought was our number one asset. We have fiber, DWP fiber in the ground covering a big portion of the city. We have all these things. We did an RFI to see what the businesses thought of our assets, what they thought would be the most, because we got this group together. We laid out all our assets. We did an RFI saying, what's our biggest assets? What do you want to partner with us? Because we want to give you access to all of our assets. And in exchange, we want a little bit of public good out of that, which is we want basic internet service for free. You can sell the premium, portable, and ubiquitous, and you can leverage all of our assets, our poles, our buildings, our everything. But we want that value change. We don't just want to bridge the digital divide, we want to blow it up. And we put that out there as a value proposition. Interestingly, in the RFI process, which was before the RFP, the businesses came back and said, actually, the most valuable asset you have is not poles. They said the most valuable asset we have is expedited permitting.
Correct.
That was the biggest cost driver for them, for these companies when they are building out the network. And so in response to that, we put together an expedited permitting group that got all the king's horses together to create. I wanted it to be exclusively for this RFP, for some legal beagle reasons, it couldn't quite be that way, but we put it together. We put the RFP out there. We had, it was 110 respondents to the RFI. We had 3 respondents to the RFP, and we do not have a winner. And it took over a year and a half. And why is that? We had 3 companies respond, one of which gave us an amazing proposal, but ultimately they weren't quite who they said they were, and they were disqualified. And the other 2, big companies, I'm not going to say if anybody represents them here, but basically they put out proposals and they wanted to get credit for all the things that they're being required for the state to do and all of the good things that they're doing already in terms of connectivity. And they were willing to do a few things on the edge in terms of our goal, but they weren't willing to give us the free lower speed coverage. In some ways, it was they're worried about cannibalizing their own industry, I imagine. It's the same mistake Ma Bell made when she didn't respond fast enough to the changing world environment and ultimately, failed back then. So it's the same kind of thing, but we had to basically throw it out and say, and these were big proposals, and this was a lot of time and energy in putting it together. I think the process was very positive because we put that asset map together. We put the expedited permitting group together, which is still out there. But part of it is the value of our poles wasn't that much because, frankly, they can get on our poles without us. In part for some of the good work that CPUC is doing and for good reasons, but we didn't have enough leverage to make this a value proposition where they were willing to give us that free asset. So that comes to your question, is what is the role of the private sector? And the RFP, I think there is that role for the public-private partnership, because I don't like the idea of the city trying to do it alone, in terms of creating this free wireless coverage, because some cities have done it and they have the legacy hardware, and you may get the money for building it, but you never have the money for maintaining it, and you want to create that partnership. Although we may end up having to go that route and creating our own utility, kind of what you're saying, and leading the pack and saying we're just going to do it. So we haven't cracked that nut yet in terms of how that partnership can work. But we have assets that are tremendously under-leveraged and underutilized. And we want to figure out how to leverage those assets, how to utilize them, and how to create a value proposition where it's not just a value for the user of them, but it is a value for the public.
The argument that when it's important enough to the business leaders in the community and the elected officials, LA seems to be able to figure out a way to get it done. So I think you're confronting some of the difficulties and the challenges of trying to deal with infrastructure and infrastructure providers. And I got to tell you that when I first got involved in renewable energy, there were a lot of fakes out there. I mean, there were a lot of people making big mistakes. So for example, Pacific Gas and Electric signed a contract with a solar power satellite that was going to beam microwave electricity from 60 miles up. They still have that contract. They're still waiting for those people to show up and build it. I don't think that they're going to have to execute that contract because that was very expensive electricity. But over time, as people started to realize that they were going to have to confront this, they started to come in and they asked for help. We actually got some pretty solid developers that didn't exist before here in the West. There were no real, and I can't speak to the scale and the ability of the city of Los Angeles. I think it is time that we start to look at statewide at what the infrastructure needs are. What is dividing us in terms of having a more rational conversation is really just government balkanization. There is intense pride in LA, much of it's deserved, that you have your own electric utility and that you have your own pole system. I'm just trying to make the point that until we actually have a statewide understanding of this infrastructure and the constraints, and we figure out how to work together to really understand what the best way is to scale, we're all going to confront these kinds of challenges separately.
Okay, we have our last preordained questioner, so to speak, is Laura Bussetto. Laura has spoken at a conferences around the Pacific Northwest, Arizona, California, how to plan for the future of vehicles. She is the public policy manager of Lyft. And with that, Laura, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Councilmember Blumenfield, for having me, and to the LA Business Council, and thank you, President Picker and Commissioner Randolph, for being here. It's good to see everyone. My question is a little bit different than the conversation today. It's about autonomous vehicles, so just a little bit of a change in subject, and I'll shorten it a little bit from the original question I was going to ask. So it's no secret that Lyft and other TNCs, which is transportation network companies, which is really Lyft, our competitor, our other competitors, we would like to play a key role in helping introduce and provide autonomous vehicles to the public. Much like Lyft has played a role in introducing electric vehicles to the public. For example, we've partnered with General Motors to bring Chevy electric Bolts to our drivers through short-term leases and rentals. My question is, what role do you see the Commission playing in formulating policies that will encourage AV usage on TNC platforms while letting innovation take place in this evolving technology area?
AV?
Autonomous vehicles.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry.
apologies.
Okay, so the current landscape with regard to autonomous vehicles is that the Department of Motor Vehicles has the basic regulations for autonomous vehicles generally. And so they're the ones who authorize companies like Lyft and GM's partnership to actually have test vehicles on the road. Where the PUC comes in is when those test vehicles are operated by TNCs, which we currently regulate. And our main sort of regulatory focus with regard to TNCs is safety, is consumer safety. So the DMV regulations focus on the vehicle itself. And we, with regard to the TNCs, sort of focus on the drivers and, sort of whether.
That's people.
Right, exactly. I'm getting to it. Yeah,
Right,
people.
it's people. But
yeah.
I thought you didn't do people. Oh, Picker doesn't do people, you do.
I do people.
Right,
Picker doesn't
okay,
do
yeah,
people.
that makes sense, actually.
Yeah. So,
Nor does Sheesh. What she does is the vehicles.
no, I do the people going into the vehicles.
Just the drivers, which they want to get rid of.
Right.
So, right, exactly, and that's where the question comes in. Sort of,
So,
what
people?
what do we as a commission do with vehicles where we traditionally are focused on the drivers and what they're doing? So, right now, we are looking at the question of the initial testing of autonomous vehicles. Because right now, under the DMV regulations, you have to have a person in the car with you as these vehicles are being tested. So, so we view that as very much kind of the traditional kind of role for the PUC in terms of making sure that the vehicle's safe and the person manning the vehicle is safe. So we have a couple different, but at the same time, we don't want to discourage the companies from testing these vehicles, and we don't want to discourage the opportunity for an average person to be able to get into the vehicle and experience the vehicle as part of that process. So, I think traditionally we have not considered free rides. We have considered free rides to be kind of just like compensated rides. So we have a couple different policy directions we could go. We could say, okay, we'll consider a free ride to be non-compensated, because the DMV regulations say you cannot use autonomous vehicles for compensated driving. So we could go in that direction and say it's not compensated. We could go in another direction and sort of have the TNCs kind of follow a basic regulatory process where they would say, okay, we are going to become a traditional type of limo company, and we will authorize them to provide these rides under that regulatory framework, which might be a bridge between currently having drivers and not currently, not having drivers in the future. So we're just looking at a couple different ways, but I think our general philosophy is we don't want to stifle the innovation, but we do want to make sure that it's kind of consistent with our basic responsibility to regulate compensated transportation and make sure it's safe and make sure that they are following the DMV rules and that the person who is in the vehicle is safe and knows what they're doing. So TBD in terms of what the detail of that will look like, but it's something we're working on.
So I have a different view, and that's not uncommon at the Public Utilities Commission. We're a deliberative body. We make our decisions based
I haven't
on-
heard this different view. I'm very interested.
I don't think we should have any role in TNCs, and I have said that before.
That's true.
I think that's a competitive marketplace, and it is irrational for us to actually be in it. If in fact we don't set rates and have more authority, that it doesn't make sense for the PUC to be in that space. It's why I don't think we should have a role in communications. The legislature feels that it's important for us to do that, in part because we have this statewide preemption around infrastructure. I think our task is a different one. You, and there's two parties here who especially are interested in autonomous vehicles, want to have that broadcast system to be able to feed information to the vehicles. Just having Google Maps is not enough. You have a lot more information that's being handed back and forth. You need to have that fairly seamless across the state. You can't have the system give out part of the way to Santa Clara and then the whole thing have to reset if the driver's lucky enough to make it to Santa Clarita rather. So I think that the core things that we have to do is figure out how do we provide the system that can support that 5G, and how do we make sure that there's universal access. We can't do that where we don't have a fully regulated marketplace. We can support competitive activities to get there, but where we will be most effective is where we can deem you need to come up with something that is universal in nature, where there's access to electricity and to fiber. And that's a significant task. And to be honest with you, I wish that we were more pared down and had that more direct focus to be able to provide those needs. But other people seem to want us to actually provide them, to be very blunt, a shield against local regulation. And so long as we have to do that for these competitive industries, we will always be a little bit distracted from these very central core infrastructure. My reason for wanting to see autonomous vehicles is that we have a greenhouse gas reduction goal statewide. The more effective use of vehicles, particularly electric vehicles, through autonomous vehicles, moving away from self-ownership and self-dispatch. And I have an electric vehicle, and so I drive it an hour a day max, and I have a charger that sits in my garage and is now used for 22 hours a day. That is not effective, efficient use of our infrastructure, nor is it universal. So what I want from autonomous vehicles is electrification, maximum utilization of the expenditures, and drive down greenhouse gas. You know, that's a good goal for the CPUC. There's lots of individual pieces. It means we're going to have to confront lots of seams in the way that we run the state of California. But I don't want to have to do fingerprint checks on Lyft drivers. That's stupid. That's really stupid.
Well, we just issued a proposed decision saying we weren't going to do that, so.
So I,
Happy to know I have a vote.
Small victories. One of my best commissioners has spent a large part of her life chasing this.
I want to answer the question because I love autonomous vehicles, but I'm not going to because I actually have to run. We have a council session that started at 10, and today's the day it's in the Valley, so it's just next door. So I'm going to run. It's time for the more general discussion, and you're going to continue it. Mary's going to continue to lead that discussion, and I'm eager to hear what comes out of it. And I just wanted to say I really appreciate having the opportunity to be here with all of you and to further this discussion. I look forward to working with each and every one of you on advancing good public policy at the city, at the state, making it all happen. So thank you very much. I apologize. I'm running out early. But they need a quorum, so I need to get there. So, good luck. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think with that, if you guys are good on time, we'll take 15 more minutes.
Let me
Allow a couple
check.
people to ask some questions.
15 more minutes
It's
work for me.
15 minutes, okay? Okay, so that means we have till 25 after. So are there others? We just got into the greenhouse gas emission reduction. I was wondering when that was going to happen. It took an hour and a half, though. And we have net zero Newhall sitting here. And we also have the university system and the state system with us today, and we have major developers who this all affects in terms of infrastructure. So I would encourage any of you to take a shot at a question.
Alex Farrell with 5 Point, and thank you for pointing out the Net Zero Newhall program. My question really is listening to this conversation. We're building a master plan community, large-scale master plan community over the next several decades. The lead agency has mandated that all of our infrastructure will be underground. So what can we do as a master developer to plan for the above-ground infrastructure needs of a 5G network?
You know, my take is that undergrounded infrastructure may be more reliable, and that you don't get interference between drunk drivers and your very valuable poles. That's why I hate people. They destroy our precious infrastructure. But you know, the experience from Sandy and from Irma and the more recent superstorms, which are likely to become more prevalent, is that undergrounded infrastructure takes a lot longer to restore. So whoever required you to underground it should understand that they may have actually doomed people to a longer period without service and the increasingly likely potential for a superstorm. I don't know enough about Newhall's characteristics to say that there's going to be sheet flooding, which is certainly the greatest threat to undergrounded infrastructure. But sheet flooding, ponded waters, bad. So I just think maybe you want to put some poles in just in case, because they're easy to string. You can get service back in 3 days rather than 3 months.
Richard? From UCLA.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. And I will ask this question not as a representative of UCLA, but someone who has regulated the cable companies for the city of Los Angeles and somebody who has represented the cable company here locally. Number one, I can say that you're absolutely right that navigating the pole system in the city of Los Angeles is very difficult. There's DWP and there's the Joint Pole Authority that are owned by a number of telecom providers. But from the standpoint of the business, and a policy that allows them to maintain their ecosystem, or at least their network, or allows them to compete effectively and efficiently without having to expend a large amount of money to do so. Is there an overarching policy whereby you could create a telecom policy that jumps the technology curve, so to speak, that allows companies to maintain their ecosystem, compete efficiently, but also fits into the overarching advancement of technology and aligning the state with the local? And so,
Are you saying, could we do it, or is it possible to have one?
is it possible to have one?
Only
if it is-
only if you guys start demanding it.
Yeah.
So, you know, a good start would be to collect data and to make it accessible, and to have a good second step would be to have a body or a forum where everybody is accountable to assessing what the standards are and the expectations are. That doesn't exist. It's balkanized. You know, the city of LA is approaching it independently from the state of California, which is only approaching it in very narrow ways. We have $300 million to spend undergrounding fiber to the home for rich people who live outside of Gilroy.
That's not all the projects.
But is that
So I think, you know, it's interesting because when the administration and the legislature sort of took a look at our regulatory authority and sort of what our scope should be, and this kind of goes to President Picker's conversation about, should we be in the transportation space? Should we be in the communication space? The challenge is that the communications regulatory scheme is so all over the place, and it's so, the federal government has its sort of roles and its regulatory scheme through the FCC, and it just sort of leaves the states with these little pieces, and the little pieces don't fit together very well. And then you have the locals with their kind of physical infrastructure challenges, that it's really hard to envision a comprehensive scheme that would really kind of foster sort of the innovation you're talking about, and align it with the infrastructure and safety needs. We do have a report that the legislature ordered that's going to come out hopefully sometime this year, about kind of the regulatory framework of the telecommunications industry and what role the state should be playing going forward. So when that report is completed, it's being done by the California Research Council, is that what it's called? I can't even remember.
It's the Research Bureau.
The Research Bureau, right, at the State Library. That'll give us kind of some interesting analysis, kind of the level setting conversation about what's the current landscape and what kind of data are we going to need, what kind of issues should we be thinking about. So I would keep an eye out for that report to think about some of those big picture questions.
Allison.
Since I am the one who read the order and found out about the 4.2 million polls, I have
That's
two questions.
pathetic. You need more in your life.
I'll be reading the.
Yeah, she totally gets the A.
Two questions. Did that project get the go-ahead, and what is your timing for that?
It is yet to be decided. The commissioners have not voted it out. This is just being released for comment. So stakeholders across the state will challenge us. This is normally where local governments do engage with us to say, hell no. But there will be a lot of complaints about privacy, and the poll authorities will be unwilling to give up their leverage in this process. So I think there's going to be a lot of consternation about this. I could be misreading it. But our goal is to have something before the commissioners sometime in November, and then to actually begin the next steps of having all the parties who have information sit down and talk about what information do we collect, what don't we collect, how do we manage it, and from that to begin to develop a roadmap that says here's how we can begin to look at that underlying infrastructure that supports the robust telecommunications network that everybody says. Then the challenge becomes what's the statewide forum to decide what's a robust telecommunication infrastructure, and then the even tougher challenge of which LA has been confronting, how do you get it built out? So it should be done sometime in the next century.
Okay, now, and then the second question was, we spent a lot of time talking about polls, but there's so much new technology coming online. I noticed that they're still installing wooden poles, but when I travel in other countries, we're not, I know that's really down in the weeds, but just curious, is there new technology coming to pole infrastructure to deal with the risks you talk about in the report?
The real issue is the conveyance, and so those countries do have poles. What they don't have is poles to home. They have poles to central fiber terminuses. Usually that's to connect to a wireless system. So this is the argument that we have at the CPUC. Should we be doing fiber to the home, or should we be doing it to a central station so that you have something that's more adaptable to future uses? There's a central debate, is wireline essential in this day and age, or should we be focusing investment dollars on broadband? The Internet of Things is going to live on a broadband wireless system as opposed to a wireline. But there are many strong voices, particularly in our arenas, that insist on having a connection to each home rather than to a broadcast center. So I think those are all issues to debate. My sense is that, you know, I only have a piece of the picture. I have a sense that broadcast is going to be more important over time. I look at the departure of customers from wireline, and I don't have a wireline at home except for internet. If I had good broadband internet, would I keep that wireline connection? I don't know. Those are all big, tough challenges and questions, but we're spending a lot of money getting that last quarter mile, that last 20 feet to somebody's home. And so all those kinds of things are going to have to come out in the wash before we get there.
And I will add that there are new pole technologies, mostly in high wildfire areas,
Yeah.
you know, where the electric utilities are moving away from kind of the traditional wooden poles and are, you know, putting in infrastructure that's more resilient.
Why don't we end with Mario, because the only thing we really haven't talked about today is the workforce and jobs. And he represents an organization that's done amazing work for veterans and placing veterans in the energy field and now technology. So Mario, do you have a final thought?
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I realize I'm in a room here of higher intellect for sure compared to the work that we do, but it is proud work. So yeah, we started 4 years ago in renewable energy. We're now in 9 different states putting military veterans to work. Everything from the recruiting to the training to the placement on projects. It's mostly utility scale solar plants. And my interest in being here today is we're about to shift into the IT sector, specifically with cybersecurity being one of our first cohorts that we're going to come out with. But the interest is to not tell the employers of the Los Angeles County area what it is that they need, but actually have a dialogue back and forth as to where your needs are so that we can tailor those classes to something of value. So when you're looking and considering our veterans and spouses, it's actually of value. So with that, yeah, I appreciate hearing about all this technology, and I think it's right in line with what we need to be in line with.
So I actually do care deeply about workforce development, you know, both for the agency that Commissioner Randolph and I work with, but also in general. So when I started, I was doing large-scale renewable energy projects. And I will tell you that the wind industry is a little more sustainable because it's global. The solar industry tends to be a little more volatile, and I'm sure you've experienced that. Yep. So we're seeing a flattening in the marketplace for rooftop solar in California. It's partly an artifact of the policies that the industry has been able to use to finance rooftop solar. Right. They're running out of those really good customers with high FICO scores and good roofs. Yeah. So that it's flattening. In California, the large-scale solar and wind industry is also flattened simply because we were so damn successful. You know, people don't think about how horrible it is to be successful. We expected it would be very difficult to meet our 2030 goal of 33% of our electricity from renewables. There's not a single regulated utility in California that hasn't blown right past that. They signed lots of contracts assuming there would be more failures. So the market's flattening here in California. Commissioner Randolph, looking to the future, to our 2030 goals, found that because of the federal tax credit structure, which may change, certainly will sunset in 2030, that there was value to contracting ahead further and some savings. But that looks like it's going to disappear if this trade dispute continues to unsettle the solar industry. So I encourage you to look to what I think is going to continue to be a far more enduring set of jobs, which is in line workers. People, not just who climb poles, but who tend the rest of the infrastructure associated with it, because that connects people. Renewables are a commodity. They are a cheap commodity. They are volatile as an industry. as we actually make surges in terms of reaching our renewables goals. What will probably be more important over time is how people use that renewable electricity for autonomous vehicles, for displacing the use of natural gases for heating and cooking and cooling, or in industry. As we start to do those things, because you can't get to our greenhouse gas goal by 2030, even if we went to 100% renewables, the electric industry is just too clean. Transportation is 40% of all our carbon emissions. If we don't build out all the infrastructure associated with what it takes to deliver that clean electricity to the things that it powers. So I think that those are the kinds of things you need to look to. You're clearly on a piece of that as you look at cybersecurity, and you have a good workforce that actually understands those issues. So I encourage you to persevere, but I would also start to think, what is it else that goes with that? Who's going to actually understand and service the 5G that's going to be at the top of those poles? Will they understand how to work at height? You know, it's not just a matter of being a good electronics technician. Can you do it in a high wind on top of a pole?
Right.
Those are skill sets that you don't get out of the universities. So I would encourage you to keep going and just start to look further. Don't read the papers, don't talk to the experts.
A sideline on that, are the polls jurisdiction of unions, or?
Generally, they are, because nobody wants to teach people how to do that.
Yeah,
But I would-
IBEW has some pretty significant training programs related to,
They're the people who structured
alignment.
the stuff at LA Trade Tech.
Yeah.
yeah.
So, and frankly, I would go figure out how you build that connection to them, because they do a pretty good job of sustaining people in that career, whereas the solar industry has not managed to build enduring jobs.
Sure. Thank you.
They are very volatile.
Well, we want to thank you, and we want to be true to our commitment to end at 10:25, and thank you for staying longer. And I just want to thank the LABC staff before we leave, because they got here very early this morning, and they worked on this for several weeks. And thank you. Adam, you guys didn't get a chance to introduce yourself. Do you want to take a moment and just introduce yourself? Okay, so with that, I think we should thank you for this thought-provoking morning. I'm hoping that it will lead to ongoing policy development and support for both of our initiatives. And it gave us a lot to think about, and I appreciate all the people that came this morning to participate in the roundtable. Thank you, and we look forward to doing this again. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.